My name is Lisa Bloom. I'm currently a scholar in resident at the Beatrice Bain Center at the Gender and Women's Studies Department at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm the author of Gender on Ice, American Ideologies of Polar Expeditions, that was written in 1993. It was the first critical feminist and post-colonial cultural studies book on the polar regions. More recently, I've written extensively on the polar regions and contemporary art and film. This paper is titled New Critical Realities, Indigenous and Scientific Collaborative Filmmaking in the Time of Climate Change. It draws on writing done for my forthcoming book project titled Polar Aesthetics in the Anthropocene, Artists and Filmmakers Respond to the Climate Crisis. The book, as well as this paper, addresses polar art and film not just as an illustration of planetary demise and a call for action, but as a challenge to our imagination. Much of this work brings into being new forms of seeing, feeling, and knowing that are connected to the crisis of visualization in the Arctic's fast-changing landscapes. Polar aesthetics here engages with the altered perceptual habits and the complex temporal and historical disjunction introduced by climate change that is no longer a disaster looming in the future, but a present and unfolding reality. This focus includes scholarship from both inside and outside of film and media studies to highlight how these new forms distinguish themselves by drawing together issues in climate change debates not routinely discussed together in current discussions in these areas, such as the physical arrangements of the human and the non-human, the fate of indigenous communities, globalizing capitalism, and persistent post-colonial relations. The paper focuses on the 2010 experimental documentary film titled, in English, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. It is 60 minutes long and is available to viewers over the internet. And for those of you who might want to use this for classroom use, I highly recommend getting it over the internet. It is an unusual collaboration between Zacharias Kunuk, an internationally known Inuk filmmaker who made the well-known 2002 film The Fast Runner, and an environmental Canadian geographer and filmmaker, Ian Marot, teaches at the University of Winnipeg, and his projects focus on food security, sustainable agriculture, and climate change. It is the first documentary in the Igloolik-based language that explores the grave political realities of northern indigenous communities and what they face in the context of accelerated climate change. Filmed in the semi-autonomous territory of Nunavut that covers areas of the Canadian Arctic and subarctic mainland, the documentary is noteworthy in shifting our view of the polar regions from the white male polar explorer's colonialist perspective of remote wilderness as unpeopled, open to exploration and possession by outsiders, to the Inuit indigenous perspective that frames the land as home and the people of the land as a mix of human and non-human forces. It is significant in that the documentary was made for both the local community by Isuma TV and for a wider international audience, and as I said, is readily available over the internet for both audiences. The film, though it was made in 2010, remains important in that it challenges the way we perceive human interaction with the natural environment and the way it privileges other ways of seeing and knowing besides the scientific. Part of the challenge of the film for international audiences is finding out how important these other perspectives are and the ways in which Western ways of seeing and knowing do not often include traditional subsistence knowledge important to the Inuit that is often dismissed in global capitalism as no longer relevant. Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change also presents an earlier prototype of what is now developing in documentaries internationally in the reportage of communities on the front lines of climate change from the perspective of indigenous filmmakers. It was included in the first film festival on Indigenous Voices on Climate Change that appeared in 2009, held in Copenhagen, that coincided with the COP15 climate talks that highlighted documentaries. The festival highlighted documentaries from Indigenous communities across the world, focusing on the ground level evidence of the impacts of and adaptations to climate change in the present tense. Since 2009, Indigenous voices in climate-themed films are starting to be shown more widely in both general film festivals around the world, such as this year's Berlin's Film Festival, Sundance, as well as environmental film festivals held at universities, such as at Yale's, amongst others. Inuit knowledge and climate change works at the intersection of aesthetics and politics, more in the tradition of documentaries that record culture, tradition, and transmit eyewitness testimony. Its aesthetic is that of the everyday, as the film records lived experiences of local elder communities, members of the community. Everyone lives in the present tense within a time that is crisis time, that is especially jarring because it disrupts traditional knowledges and skills that the community has relied on for centuries. The film largely dispenses with the filmmaker's voice and with the usual chronologies and contexts. Instead, the filmmaker allows its subjects to speak without intrusions to allow the focus to be on the uncontrolled thoughts of the Inuit elders. They are joined by Sheila Watt-Coultier, a well-known spokeswoman for the Inuit community on the Inuit Circumpolar Council, along with Mary Simon, past Minister of Northern and Indigenous Affairs. In the context of climate change, the eyewitness accounts of the film make the viewer aware of how intimately connected to the Arctic the Inuit elders who speak in the film and who live there are. They exchange stories that are central to their endurance and vitality, explaining that they have until recently been a hunting community, and over the many thousands of years that the community has lived there, they have been close observers of animals and nature. The film is shot in Resolute Bay and many other communities around Nunavut, and the interviews by the Inuit elders reveal that there's a long historical tradition of seeing the environment as a necessary skill for surviving off the land. This is a system called IQ and is well known to the Inuit audiences of this film. The film indeed regards this knowledge as living, alive to change, and capable of changing with change, a whole other system of knowing, feeling, and listening to the environment. The film focuses at length on the way the Inuit are observing the immensity of cascading change by relating the ongoing shifts of its climate to local consequences, including how warmer temperatures are disrupting fragile ecosystems and the mobility of the Inuit as well as that of the animals. The film begins with an observation of one of the elders, quote, "Today it is impossible to correctly predict weather. By observing the sky, weather was predicted, cloud formations indicated wind directions, now it is different," close quote. This is an ongoing, deep concern expressed throughout the film in different ways. It voices the sense of disorientation the Inuits are feeling and living through now as climates and atmospheres, formerly important points of organization in their life, are rapidly changing as a consequence of severe global warming. The film is shot from a perspective that presents the climate and the landscape through the lens of native ancestral traditions of observation and oral traditions. That is not the viewpoint of the Arctic as the last empty frontier, open to exploration and possession by outsiders, nor does it conform with general Western concepts of a quote-unquote unpeopled wilderness, dominating the older discourses on the Arctic. This is an altogether different aesthetic in another register that challenges foundational assumptions of the Western sublime. Such an approach incorporates the auditory and the haptic that brings the human and the non-human world closer together in a pan-Arctic world of places and species. The film begins with an elder reminiscing on the land about how he was taught since childhood to observe everything around him. For him, this is a long-lived process of immersion, perception, and adaptation. His skills include greater listening and what is referred to as quote unquote wisening to a world. That includes close perception of the rhythms of sunlight and darkness and awareness of different phases of the moon, as well as the importance of wind direction for governing environmental conditions. The camera focuses on Nunavut not as a vast empty region, but as an inhabited one in which communities have shaped their livelihoods both outdoors and indoors out of flexible and intimate relationships with their ecosystems. It includes footage that reenacts shots of Inuit daily life as it was lived by the elders in their childhood and continues to be lived by many members of the community. The haptic is emphasized through the hands-on scenes where they hunt animals for food to later carve up and eat. Much of this footage combines outdoor images not far from where the interviewees live with interior ones filmed inside of living and workplaces. Inuit knowledge shows how Inuit practices of observation and adaptation even extends to experimenting and incorporating Western technologies and consumer products into their everyday lives. This is seen both in interior and exterior shots where we can see the integration of, say, consumer goods, including motorized snowmobiles, computers, cameras, etc., while reinventing appropriate uses for them that suit their community-specific needs as they now combine a lifestyle of hunting and fishing from their older traditions and technologies within a wage-based consumer economy. This is made clear by footage that combines tradition with a more modern contemporary lifestyle. This aesthetic of incorporating technologies into the everyday is also part of the political project of Asuma TV's multimedia, multi-platform productions that attempts to reconstruct traditional life in relation to the present, to rewrite a long tradition of racist stereotypes of indigenous cultures by Western films and images. This particular documentary is one of many efforts to argue that colonization actually never succeeded and to present the ways that indigenous resistance and resilience have been active and ongoing, both politically and in everyday life. Kunik and Mauro's film aims to construct a mode of analysis of a crisis-shaped subjectivity amid the ongoingness of adaptation and improvisation. Many times their views are directly at odds with Western perspectives, particularly when it comes to science. One of the more controversial insights for the filmmakers that caused a significant backlash by the scientific community was the Inuits' belief that the Earth had actually changed its tilt. Through the process of making the film, this observation was eventually given a context that enabled Ian Mauro, the film's environmental filmmaker, to reconcile the elders' observation of how the sun, moon, and stars were shifting with a scientific perspective about global warming's ability to produce visual distortions. Clearing up this misunderstanding between these very different communities was one of the major accomplishments of this film and resulted in Western scientists taking these stories of lived experience from the Inuit community more seriously. Another point of contention is how, for the Inuit elders, polar bears are not a recognizable symbol of anthropogenic climate change, as it is for many people around the globe. Instead, they have a quite different and far less transcendent meaning in this local context. For the Inuit elders interviewed in this film, the bears are real living and breathing animals whose behavior, they argue, have been adversely affected by marine biologists. The interviewees consider the efforts on the part of biologists to conserve polar bears to be in conflict with their local traditional interests, including their right to determine appropriate interactions with wildlife. Their worry is not about the polar bear's extinction, but the reasons why the polar bears have become more aggressive and pose a greater threat to the community in the context of climate change. Some of their concerns focus on what they see as the destructive technologies used by marine biologists to manage the bears, the way polar bears are drugged through tranquilizers, how the bear's hearing is affected from the overuse of helicopters to remove them, and the improper placement of the radio collars on their necks that prevent them from reaching inside the seals' breathing holes to find fish and mammals to eat. Inuit elders consider the technologies used by marine biologists on the polar bears as an intrusive force on the local Inuit population. Their position foregrounds how cultural, political, and economic differences shape their thinking. Though the local Inuit interviewed in this film do not see polar bears in danger from climate change, most scientists who study polar bears in the Arctic disagree and claim that loss of sea ice does present a significant threat to these mammals. The local community, though, is not anti-science, and this can be seen by the way there is less disagreement between the local community and the scientists regarding the negative impacts of the modernization of the contemporary Arctic, and how the coal and oil industries were also oblivious or even destructive of the cultures that live there. Sheila Watt-Cloutier, an Indigenous activist who was a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize and most recently is the International Chair for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, discusses at length how the severe environmental neglect and damage were one of the lasting legacies of extreme industrialization in the Arctic. Radioactive leaks and waste, together with other toxic industrial waste, have in recent decades become concentrated in the northern regions. She further explains how this was exacerbated by long-range air and water pollution concentrated by atmospheric winds in the Arctic. Mary Simon, who was past Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Special Representative on Arctic issues, is another prominent spokesperson in the film, especially in these segments devoted to the declining state of their ecosystems. Here, she is critical of the Canadian government's abandonment of the Kyoto Protocol, its limited measures to fight against global warming during Harper's conservative government, and its mindset of quote-unquote profit above all else when the film was made in 2009. She and Sheila Watt-Cloutier are alarmed by how toxins known as persistent organic pollutants, known as POPs, from oil refineries in Canada are ending up in the Arctic ecology. Other Inuit women and men, such as Miali Elise Caleb, interviewed in this tape, expressed worries for her own health and that of local animals, fish, seals, caribou, and polar bears, as they discovered these toxins as well as mercury turning up in the now contaminated mammals and fish they eat. For the Inuit elders in this film, the environment is nothing less, in their words, quote, than the material basis for their existence. And they want to have a voice in the intergovernmental politics of global warming, pollution, and the ecologies of the Arctic today. As Mary Simon put it in the film, quote, "We cannot exist by purely making money. If we do not have our environment, we cannot survive." Though the Inuit have demonstrated significant adaptability in the face of current changes in climate conditions so far by transmitting traditional Inuit knowledge from one generation to the next, strong social networks and growing political power, the added threat emanating from toxins south of the Arctic, and the acceleration of climate change remains an extremely serious hazard to the survival of these communities in the future. The nutritional benefits of the food they hunt is important to their sustenance in a way that less nutritional commercial food that is also very costly cannot be. But just as important, if the community is unable to hunt and fish traditional game, the elders worry that this will also spell the end of the cultural transmission of social customs and their ability to pass down folklore and traditions to the next generation. This amounts to nothing less than the destruction of their food sources as a loss, not only as a source of nutrition, but also as a form of sociality and identity. Kunik and Mauro's film has revealed new perspectives from filmmakers who are making connections between Indigenous histories, scientific practices, and the growing environmental threats in the modern Arctic. In doing so, their film creates an alternative visual archive and cinematic language that is informed by the Inuits' own aesthetics and traditions that are being disrupted as their life is rapidly changing as a result of accelerated global warming. Through eyewitness testimony, their film demonstrates how the Indigenous people of Igloolik and the whole territory of Nunavut are experiencing what Rob Nixon calls, quote-unquote, the slow violence of climate change, and the way it diminishes their way of life and ultimately can lead to these communities' relocation. As I've argued, Kunuk and Maro's aesthetic is more everyday, but at the same time, it pushes the viewer to imagine a whole different way of knowing and seeing the Arctic environment that acknowledges the local knowledge system of Arctic indigenous people about global warming, which is one removed from a statistical perspective and is much closer to home, that is literally down to earth. The new visual vocabulary created in this film suggests the importance of the input of indigenous populations in Nunavut to change the science in the case of the polar bears, whereas in the example of the toxins known as POPs from oil refineries, Sheila Watt-Cloutier and Mary Simon are putting pressure on the politicians to respect the findings of scientific data and enact regulations to stop the toxins from poisoning the Arctic ecology. Such cinematic collaborations, as represented here, suggest future possibilities for critical cinematic work that challenges the viewer to incorporate post-colonial and native knowledge into their thinking to better understand the importance of a more situated approach to documentary filmmaking for confronting a troubled future at a time of climate crisis. Thank you.